Good evening, everyone. We'll get started in just a few moments as we allow our attendees to fill the Zoom space tonight. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's discussion. My name is Scott Blair. I'm the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at DeSales University. And in honor of Black History Month, it's my pleasure to be joined by Dr. Lauren Brown as we discuss this evening athlete activism in the era of Black Lives Matter. And very timely discussion on so many levels. And we're going to have a very engaging. I'm looking forward to the conversation with Dr. Brown, speaking about her experience and the scholarship and research that she brings in this space. A little bit of an introduction to Dr. Brown in just a moment. But before we start that, I do want to provide some quick information for our attendees joining us, whether faculty, staff, students, alumni, or visitors from our community. Please feel free to offer any questions you may have using the Q&A feature here on Zoom. And this is being recorded. So if we have any friends or colleagues or fellow students who were hoping to join this evening but are unable to attend, please know that the recording in a couple of days will be available on the Office of DEI website at DeSales University. So without further ado, let me introduce our presenter, our keynote for this evening's discussion. And Dr. Lauren Brown is an associate professor of sport management at DeSales. Dr. Brown's research interests are on corporate social responsibility in sports, and also, as stated before, brings a focus on athlete philanthropy and activism. And of course, this is a really welcomed lens for tonight's discussion. Furthermore, Lauren's research has been stated, but she's also able to present to us over 5 years of NCAA administrative experience in athletics, most notably at SUNY Stony Brook, but also in graduate assistantships at both Villanova and Cornell University. So with that, I pass the virtual microphone over to Dr. Brown for tonight's discussion. Good evening, Lauren.
Good evening, Scott. Thanks for having us. And to everybody who's listening, welcome. Thank you for taking time on a Tuesday night. As Scott said, this is incredibly timely, and I think it's great that we are in a place where we as an institution are having this conversation. I think Scott and I would be happy to have it anyway privately, so it's nice of all of you to join us tonight. But sport continues to provide this unique context in which we can explore and examine our society. Obviously, the many means by which we engage with sport have given athletes a platform that is not available to most other folks. So looking at the contributions they've made in the space of activism over this year, I think is incredibly fascinating, and I hope you all have a bunch of questions. So plan of attack is we're going to give a little bit of history to start, because those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it, and I want to make sure we're touching on that. We'll go through the history briefly, speak to some exemplars of modern activism, and then open it up to questions. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And let's get rolling on this. Oop, helps if we start at the beginning, doesn't it? Okay. So, and you'll have to forgive me if I'm looking to the side. As some of you know, I am want to ramble and go off on tangents. So I want to make sure I'm good about my notes. But as you can see, this summer, athlete activism was front and center in so many respects. We have here NBA player Bradley Beal and WNBA player Natasha Cloud at one of the many Black Lives Matter protests this summer. But when we talk about the history of activism, we should probably, it helps to frame it using um, Harry Edwards' waves of athlete activism. For those of you unfamiliar, Harry Edwards is a much celebrated activist and author and faculty member at San Jose State University. And he's put together, like I said, this nice framework, and we're kind of in this odd spot right now where we're transitioning in our waves. But first wave of athlete activism he really talks about is just pure recognition. So our earliest Black athletes and how they were able to gain any sort of recognition and legitimacy. And when we talk about that, we're talking about Jack Johnson in boxing, as well as Joe Louis, Jesse Owens, which, as someone who has their doctorate from Ohio State, we are more than familiar with Jesse Owens, since half the campus is named after him at this point, rightfully so. We talk about that second wave. This is where we start to talk about proper integration. When we're talking about Jack Johnson, Jesse Owens, Joe Louis, you're talking about folks in individual sports. Second wave is that team integration where you're talking about Kenny Washington, Jackie Robinson, and the like. I think the third wave of athlete activism is the golden era, it's often called. I'd like to think we're moving into a new golden era, but I think it's what people most think about. You think about those athletes who were very active in the civil rights movement. Certainly social justice. We will talk about the Olympic Project for Human Rights at points. But that third wave is what we definitely think of traditionally as athlete activism. And then between the third and the fourth wave, there was a lull where athletes were not really engaging. It also coincided with the commercial growth of sport. So I know Michael Jordan often gets credited, and nobody's really sure if he said it or not, that Republicans also buy shoes when he wouldn't support Jesse Helms' opponent in a senatorial race, which, whether he said it or not, I think everything behind that statement explains where they were at. It was about the commercial interest. But as we start to move into the early 21st century, you start to see signs of change. And that fourth wave is generally accredited to 2010, but as I'll say in a few minutes, we could probably look a few years earlier where that conversation was starting. And, that fourth wave was Black athletes really starting to use their power and their influence in a new way. And I think right now we're kind of moving into this fifth phase, but it's not well developed enough yet. I'm not comfortable enough to make declarative statements about it at this point. But those are the five waves with which we can generally look at athlete activism. However, when you look at how we have been taught that history, a lot of this negates the contributions of women, even as important as the Olympic Project for Human Rights was, culminating obviously in the protests at the Mexico City Olympics with Tommie Smith and John Carlos. Even groups like that, while women were involved, the idea of women as equal partners was not established. Women, like I said, the contributions were often overlooked. So when you look at like Wilma Rudolph demanding that her welcome home celebration after she won 3 golds in the 1960 Olympics, she had to demand that that be integrated. Things like that aren't discussed as often. So we want to make sure that we acknowledge that the full contribution of women athletes in sport is not often discussed. We see it. I don't think we can also discuss a history of athlete activism without looking at the problematic role of governing bodies. Certainly the 1968 Olympics is a great example of that, how governing bodies, be it through their own prejudices, control about commercial interests, things of that nature, have looked to quash athlete activism over the years. Congratulations, Tommie Smith. You just set a world record. We're sending you home for raising your fist is the most obvious example of that. But there are so many others, even as recently as 2016. Megan Rapinoe talking about to her teammates about taking a knee. And since then, Crystal Dunn has come out and said she was not comfortable participating in that because as a Black athlete who was not as established on the team, she was concerned about retribution. And some of the actions of US soccer at that time period indicated that probably wasn't a ridiculous thought. So governing bodies have consistently quashed athlete activism, and their role still continues to be really challenging. But as I said, this modern athlete activism will generally say it's the fourth wave around 2010, but you start to see some signs right around Hurricane Katrina being a major inflection point. So obviously, we had a ton of athletes who were engaged in trying to rebuild New Orleans after Katrina. But that's when you started to have those conversations, and people were openly saying, well, look, the Black neighborhoods are disproportionately affected by this, and commenting on the systemic racism involved in this, and that is why people need to work to rebuild. So I think we need to look at that as the first change. We also start to see other examples that, quite frankly, didn't get that much attention in our country. Venus Williams' fight for female pay at Wimbledon tends to get overlooked. The only reason it got, put it this way, it got more attention when Ava DuVernay did her 30 for 30 Venus versus, looking at Venus's battle, which was, I believe, 8 years after she had earned the right for equal pay. So we're seeing those changes in the early aughts. And then certainly you started to see other examples creeping into even our game day engagement. So for instance, the NBA players, including LeBron James, wearing "I Can't Breathe" t-shirts after Eric Garner's shooting in 2014. So that was when we started to see some change. And then obviously 2016, if this wants to work with me, there we go. 2016 was a very clear inflection point. I think many of us remember, especially in July, the sheer number of shootings. The summer was already off to a challenging start. And I use that word carefully because I think challenging is a wild understatement. But the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando occurred in June. As a reference point, the WNBA was very much on board with players showing their support in their pregame attire following that particular crisis. And I say that because we will come back to that. You go a month later, you have in very quick succession, 3 straight days, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and 5 Dallas police officers shot. We saw a number of responses from notable athletes going back to tennis. Serena Williams was in the middle of Wimbledon and was asked about it every day. We saw the beginning of the ESPYs the next week with, again, NBA players getting up and saying this needs to stop. The WNBA players also took a strong stand. What was fascinating about this response, and ties back to my previous slide, teams wore the shirts, as you can see on the picture on the screen. Teams wore those shirts without sanction of the league, and because the league hadn't sanctioned it, they started fining players and teams. And players felt like they were being silenced, which governing bodies, as I said, had done in the past. So you have players fighting back, not only fighting against the challenging relationship between the Black community and the police, but also not taking it from their governing bodies. Tina Charles, for those of you who don't know, was the 2012 WNBA MVP. She is a many-time All-Star. Forgive me, I think it's 7 or 8. Not the most important thing you're going to learn tonight, I hope, but she is a player of stature. And at that juncture, she posted this on the night she was given the Player of the Month award, posed in a black shirt saying she won't be silenced. And the WNBA ultimately rescinded those fines, but it's a perfect microcosm of everything we're talking about. The bigger problem here is that people are getting shot. People are disproportionately getting shot, but the WNBA is worried about a t-shirt. We've got questions. Finally, and probably most obviously, Colin Kaepernick first took a knee in 2016. And one of the things that I want to highlight, and something that Scott and I have discussed privately, I think a lot of folks tend to forget that Kaepernick's action, this was not, he initially sat and then he spoke to a veteran who said, "Why don't you kneel instead?" And that is how we got to this point. And Kaepernick being blackballed, I think most folks know the story, so I won't go through it. But obviously, we're still talking about this. Colin Kaepernick has not taken the field since then. And for my many NFL fans in the room, I think we all know, with all due respect to our spectacular athletes, there are a lot of quarterbacks who are significantly less talented than Colin Kaepernick who have taken the field since the end of the 2016 season. So 2016 was an inflection point, and then that will bring us to this year. And because this is recent, I'm not going to spend a ton of time, and I'm going to try to not laundry list stuff. But as you saw in the opening slide, we've got athletes protesting across many sports, getting very engaged with the shootings that came up as we're in the middle of a pandemic and all of the challenges that we faced in the spring and summer of this year. Likewise, so many of our athletes got involved in the election, feeling that ways to make change, one of the ways to make systemic change is to be active in our political system. So obviously, that included a lot of voter education, converting arenas and stadiums into voting sites. Many of our athletes work the polls, which is something that, I recognize LeBron deserves every headline he gets, but I think more folks were paying attention to him and not looking at the sheer number of folks who had boots on the ground. Again, I don't want to turn this into, well, we can turn this into an hour on the WNBA. I wouldn't entirely mind, but I think we also can't talk about the election without acknowledging that the WNBA players, again, no interest in kowtowing to their governing body, recognized their strength and their voice, and went to vote out an owner who said she was not on board with their focus on Black Lives Matter for their bubble season. Kelly Loeffler was a senator from Georgia, and after she wrote an open letter saying that Black Lives Matter doesn't have a place in the season in the league, most of the teams had Vote Warnock signs or shirts made and wore them into the arenas pregame, and they worked actively to unseat their owner, which they did. I think it's also particularly, and Scott, this is again another comment you and I have had in our conversations. Kelly Loeffler is a partial owner of the Atlanta Dream, a team that is literally named because of Dr. King. So saying that Black Lives Matter has no place seems, there's a whole lot of cognitive dissonance going on there. In addition to get out the vote processes, they a number of new organizations were founded, which was important, especially in sports that hadn't had that representation. WNBA, again, better focused their initiatives. Now they have a social justice council so that they are more centralized beyond just the work that they had done through the Players Association. Baseball established the Players Alliance, which is incredibly important to note because baseball has a very fraught history in engaging with race. Real quick to celebrate Jackie Robinson, not so great on actual substantive change beyond, yes, you can play. You saw organizations, Black Women's Player Collective, and the Black Players for Change in soccer, so the NWSL and the MLS. We're starting to see those organizations so that we are better supporting Black athletes in leagues that have not been friendly in the past. And I think it's also worth noting the nominal, and I use nominal very specifically, cooperation from governing bodies. A lot of leagues are throwing a lot of money at a lot of causes, and that can't go without being noticed. I acknowledge the NFL's $250 million commitment. However, you can look at Patrick Mahomes on your screen. They're saying that, yes, we are on board with social justice, and yet you still have your highest profile player and a team that has appeared twice in the Super Bowl the past 2 years with a racist mascot and nickname. So how far are we actually going? Not to pick on the NFL, but honestly, they're making it easy. This is also, what are we, 2 weeks removed from the initial report that in their concussion settlement, some of the procedures related to the settlement are discriminating against Black players and making it harder for folks to get money. Um, and I should also point out, instead of just fully laundry listing the NFL's challenges, um, as much as folks are putting money at things and you had Black Lives Matters on courts this summer, there's still a certain amount of policing messages. So for the NBA, you can have certain messages on the back of your jersey, but we're going to approve them first. So there's still a certain amount of silencing that's going on. So that is my hopefully brief um, outline of kind of where we've gone, where we are. So at this point, I am going to adjust one more time to share the queen, and I guess we'll take questions at this point, Scott.
That's perfect. And again, for our visitors here watching from afar, again, we encourage you to provide any questions you might have. There's so much for us to process and discuss. And maybe Dr. Brown, one of the first things that we'll put out into the air for conversation is, let's talk about the sports leagues as a whole and their recent commitments to diversity and inclusion related efforts and advocacy, and some of the community social awareness campaigns that you referenced before. That's one aspect of this.
Mhm.
The other side of this is the criticism they've received about the lack of diverse leadership in the coaching ranks, in the executive suites, not just of the NFL, the WNBA, go down the list. So maybe thoughts and perspectives on that dynamic to the discussion.
It's terrible. I muted myself and didn't get back to it that fast. I think my experience and my gut both say that we're dealing with levels of hypocrisy, because one of the challenges we run into with the leagues is, even if you have a commissioner who is interested and committed to change, the commissioner still answers to the owners. And the owners' behaviors, especially in regards to changes with leadership, have largely shown that they're not making the change. They are, again, putting money towards things, but are they making the changes in their organizations? Again, I hate to go back to the NFL again, but even as a proper Philadelphian, I noticed that our team hired a man who's been a coordinator for a couple of years, who, bless him, I hope he's very successful, but I have I taken the time to remember his name? No. I've got questions about, why didn't you speak to Deuce Staley, who's given 2 decades? Why didn't you properly speak to Deuce Staley, who's given 2 decades to your organization? Why haven't we talked to Eric Bieniemy, who works for a man who you happily employed for 15 years? Why didn't you talk to either the offensive or defensive coordinators in Tampa, who just won the Super Bowl? I think we're not seeing the progress. The Rooney Rule's been in place for almost 20 years. The NFL hasn't made progress. Um, Certainly for folks who want to do a little more of a deep dive into the information, I didn't want to pull up a ton of charts tonight. I was hoping for more of a discussion. University of Central Florida's race and gender diversity report cards for major leagues are a good place to just get a quick glance as to how we haven't quite seen that change yet. And that's, experience has taught me that, show me with your actions. Show me you are willing to do this in your own organization, not just give money towards something. The money is important. I am not making light of any donation, the millions of dollars that baseball is putting towards working with the Players Alliance, but show me something else.
Right. And the financial resources help. And as we have this
Yeah.
conversation, I can't help but mention just something that hit the bottom line on Sports Center even just this evening, about Michael Jordan's $10 million
Yeah.
contribution to local hospitals in the North Carolina area. So complicated, but still opportunities to explore more. And also, for those who are attending, take a look at Tony Dungy talking about the
Mhm.
representation piece in the NFL, and even
Yeah.
Muffet McGraw and her conversations about that when she was in
Mhm.
uh, over there at Notre Dame as the women's basketball coach. We have two fantastic questions, Lauren, that have come to us. Um, the
Okay.
first one, the first one is a great question, and it is as follows. Um, I'm embarrassed to say this, but as a sports fan, I confess that I engage. Oh, it's okay. I
I'm
engage in
fussing around.
sports to escape the woes of the world. Watching a game and following sports closely allows me to forget the political nightmares and social injustices of our day.
Mhm.
I admire the courage of college and professional athletes using their voices for common good and serving as exemplars of justice. Do you have any counsel to allay my guilt or relax my desire for sports to be a context that is all about the game, the players, their hard work, the gathering, the community, the cultivation of team pride? It's a complicated item, but a great question for us to consider.
Yeah. So I think one of the sport is an escape. I mean, literally, I we were talking about that in the sport marketing class on Monday. Um, However, I think like anything else, we need to be careful to remember that athletes aren't here. Athletes are humans. They are people who were not put on this earth simply to be our entertainment and nothing else. We need to make sure we give them the space to explore the humanity the same way any of the rest of us are. Um, we don't have to feel guilty about wanting that escape. I think we all want it. It's just there are going to be times and places where something else needs to be salient. And I think certainly over this year, for the Black athlete, with the, again, engagement with the police, the disproportionate effect of COVID in Black communities, this just isn't that moment.
Great point. And as we engage in this conversation, we see so many examples of how athletes in the sports world has been an example for
Mhm.
change. And as we have this conversation, we're just about a month out in which the world changed in so many ways in March of 2020 with respect to COVID. And a lot of those changes actually came because of some of the actions that some of the sports league, and I think most notably the NBA and the WNBA, did with respect to COVID protocols in the middle of March. So the impacts they're all over. So, but a great question. Thank you for offering that, Dr. Brown. We have another one, and this one kind of creeps into the Title IX space and the gender space. What are your thoughts, and especially the research and scholarship that you bring along with your time in college athletics? What are your thoughts on universities that have ended programs but continue to fund sports such as football and basketball, and also recognizing that some of those adjustments disparately impact, especially women athletes in some of the Olympic sports?
This is an incredibly hard question. Um, it is, I think the first thing everybody needs to understand is people will, the men's basketball media contract, specifically March Madness, funds the NCAA. And while the NCAA is able to remain a nonprofit because so much of that money trickles down to the institutions, this is not enough to save institutions who are in financial difficulty right now, um, because of the pandemic. So I just, let's get the finances out there. If we're talking about football, football makes money for a handful of campuses, but not for most institutions. I think the challenge any institution runs into is one, if I'm an athletic director, one of my concerns needs to be how do I make sure that my people aren't fired or furloughed in this moment? Um, but I think the conversation we're not having enough is when we look at COVID, what are the implications for people's health? Like, how, if we're really looking at priorities, how do we ignore the fact that we have hundreds of thousands of people dead and we don't know what the long term effects are? I understand we also have these economic concerns to go with. We don't want universities closing so that people don't have jobs. Nobody wants to lay anybody off. We don't want people furloughed. But that's a hard balance. I'll be honest. I'm glad I'm not an AD right now because it's not a decision I would like to make. As someone whose family has been affected by COVID-19, I'd personally rather see them not be playing. But I understand the arguments. I just think we need to be very, very, very careful and how it's affected women's sports, especially with teams. And forgive me, I saw this in passing yesterday, and I'm forgetting one school already won their Title IX argument, and it's women swimming and diving, and I'm blanking on the institution. I'm so sorry. Women swimming and diving is coming back, but the men's team is remaining cut.
Okay.
And I think I say this in my classes all the time. Sports being cut is the worst case scenario. Nobody wants that. That is not how we work to achieve equity through Title IX, is cutting men's sports. So I don't feel good about any of it, regardless. As seeing any teams cut, it's just not. It's not the essence of college sport.
If I'm reading correctly, I think it was East Carolina. I just did a really
Thank
quick.
you. Yeah, I
Sure.
blanked in that moment.
It's okay. Just did a quick scan. Thank you for offering that question, and Dr. Brown for the response. We have two additional questions coming in from our attendees. The first one, and I'm personally I'm glad this one was asked. It's one that we had on our list to ask as well. And the attendee offers the following: I'm not into sports at all, but I saw the NFL ad that was aired during the Super Bowl, and yes, the money is good, but I thought it was so tone deaf. Why do you think the NFL hasn't acknowledged their mistreatment of Colin Kaepernick if they are claiming to be so committed to fighting systemic racism through the NFL? Thank you for that question. Dr. Brown?
Yeah, so I don't think they are. I mean, the Kaepernick suit was settled, which usually is an indication that I don't think this is going to go well, or this is going to be enough that it's dragged out. I think the NFL is falling back on the fact that Roger Goodell, the commissioner, has said we should have listened to Kaepernick. He has said that in multiple interviews. But again, what substantive changes are being made? You're not seeing Black head coaches. You're not seeing Black coordinators. Tampa, withstanding, their staff is an example that others should follow. Right. But I found it very tone deaf, and that was something that I will not pretend that was not expressed to our students on Monday when we talked about their attempts at showing unity, and it felt very clumsy and awkward. Even the arrangement of the national anthem, of all things, it's like, oh, folks, just because you have a country singer and an R&B singer, that's not substantive change. That's not unity. You got two musicians together. Congrats. We've been combining genres for years. I think this is one of those cases where they're hoping no one's paying close enough attention.
Right.
See, look at the big number of money we donated. Look at this commercial. Look at that. But again, what's going on when you really pull back the curtains?
Right. Structural changes as opposed to some of these surface level changes that we've seen. And there has been so much attention on the hiring, not just in coaches, but even in the executive suites. And we do want to also honor the other sports. And as mentioned before, if you haven't had a chance to review for our attendees, please take a look at Muffet McGraw. I believe it was the 2018 Final Four. And she's also kind of Lehigh Valley zone too. I know her coaching roots originally started here in the Valley, but spoke very, very well. Some of the bias that unfortunately gets presented in these searches that prevents us from truly having diverse staffs. And the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are a great example of what we can be. So thank you for that question. Lauren, I want to be mindful of, it's you and I, so if you need to take a sip of water, by all means. But the next question, and I think there's this dynamic between the NFL and other sports leagues. And we've talked about the NBA and the WNBA most notably, about some of the strengths we've seen out of that space. And it's from there that the following question is provided for our consideration. In the past year, it is clear to see the measures the NBA has taken to promote activism, as we've discussed this evening. I am sure many, including players, are still unsatisfied. There's still more work to be done. The question is, where does Adam Silver, who's the commissioner of the NBA, and the league go from here? What future measures would you like to see them make at a league level? And also, what can other leagues learn from the NBA and the WNBA as well?
I think the challenge for any of this is you need the education piece. You need to change people's biases. And that is some deep level learning that needs to be unlearned. And people need to commit to that. Most people don't realize the extent of their biases. Anyone who is in SS200, you will be looking at it tomorrow morning. Oddly enough, I didn't plan it that way. Um, but because I think, we all have our own junk. We have to take a step back from it. Um, but again, it comes back to the owners. Yeah, it's terrible. I keep thinking of all the terrible things I tell them in class. Fish rots from the head. So if the owners aren't going to make changes, I mean, even you've got Mark Cuban who's willing to engage in these conversations, but then I see him doing an interview with a Barstool shirt on, which is, for those of you unfamiliar with Barstool Sports, exceedingly problematic. Their leadership has very much shown great deal of misogyny and racism. So it's folks have to be willing to educate themselves first, and that's not a simple process. I think if we had an answer for it, we'd be in a much better place as we approach 55, 60 years post civil rights.
Right.
But I don't have a great answer for it. If I had a great answer, I would have probably sold it and retired by now. But I think you can certainly learn from leagues in the willingness to engage with their players. However, you have to also look at the commercial interests of the league. We can't divorce that. When you look at the WNBA's fan base broadly, you're talking about a demographic that is going to be more open to these conversations to begin with. WNBA's fan base tends to be more female, slightly wealthier than the average fan base, and significantly more diverse in the very many ways we can say that. So WNBA fans are much quicker to dive in as opposed to some of our older, more entrenched leagues that very much remain the old boys club. So I wish I had a better answer. But we still got a lot of work to do.
We do. And now, for those who are or are not in the sports marketing, sports management space, right, we're introducing some really important terms, which I think provide some valuable context as to, yes, why are some leagues leaning into this more than others, right? And that's the sports marketing segmentation conversation, and that's some of those dynamics that the NBA and WNBA may have in its favor versus other sports leagues. And we can't lose sight of the fact that this isn't just a 5-year struggle post 2016, post Colin Kaepernick, as Dr. Brown continues to allude to. This is 1950s and 60s, and even prior to that, right? We're talking about Jim Thorpe, even and even beyond that. So,
Well, and
couldn't help.
Scott, if I can jump in too, I think one of
Please,
the things that we also forget, not just that this is a lifelong struggle, but these are people's lives. We're talking about degrading people's humanity, and I think we lose track of that. One of the things that, well, I'm about to go really Dr. Brown on everyone, and I apologize, but when you look at the academic literature about activism, one of the things that leaps out is an act people are more inclined towards activism if they have internalized that identity, if that is so central to who you are. Now, that's not an easy thing to capture. I don't, it's hard to point to people's motivations, but you can't help but notice, even though it is not an actual motivator, when you look at the number of people, especially for college age students, because you're starting to form a civic and political identity, you do tend to see groups that have been marginalized over time be more engaged. And we need to think about it, even as we look at our athletes. Okay, so they have embraced their identity as activists, but what does that do to them beyond that? How is that affecting their personal well-being? Again, they're fighting back against causes that are largely affecting them, because the leagues that we've been talking about most regularly are leagues that are majority Black, and they're working for racial justice issues. So you're worried about your family. The fight is exhausting because people aren't hearing you, people aren't responding, and that humanity, that totality of their humanity gets lost in the conversation, is something that I think we need to bring up more and more and more, especially in a year like this where we're dealing with the pandemic. I don't want to overuse the term self-care, but we all need to know when to power down. And I think that goes for our athlete activists as well. And will be interesting to see how that manifests itself in the future, because the fight is continuing, and we see that. Certainly, just today, I hate to give a Boston Celtic credit, but Marcus Smart engaging with the impact that the pandemic has had on the Black community, doing a webinar similar to us, us and Marcus Smart, totally the same.
Right.
And Simone Biles recognizing that she has the platform, and she is the only gymnast who has the platform to continue to hold USA Gymnastics to task for the abuse of their athletes. So our athletes aren't resting, our Black athletes aren't resting. I think we also need to be careful to not put all of this on them. Sport affects all of us. That's why we're having this conversation. That's why people are giving up their evening. So
Right.
how are we, those of us from a participative perspective, those of us who are engaged with the industry on a business level, what are we doing to support their efforts? They have the platform, they still need help with boots on the ground. I think looking at that from the lens of their humanity and folks who are committed to these changes, I think there's a lot of work that can be shared.
Right. Much to reflect on. And as you mentioned, the identity development of the athlete and their ability to then transform their passions and their experiences into this activism space, to be able to review the work of Dr. Harry Edwards, Dr. Todd Boyd, who speaks so eloquently about that identity development, and also acknowledging that not everyone can take those internalized passions and have the confidence to have the voice that we have seen the Megan Rapinos, the LeBron Jameses go down the list. So really, really good stuff. And we're starting to get some more questions in here from our attendees, which is great. This is a good question, Dr. Brown. It is as follows. I think that elite college and professional sports teams have done a good job with matters such as racism, racial identity work, poverty, inequities in education, and some gender issues, especially the breast cancer awareness campaigns. However, it feels to me that sensitivity to LGBTQ plus issues seem to be put on the back burner. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so full disclosure, not my wheelhouse quite the way the race and issues related to women are. However, I I don't think they are salient at the moment. I think it also depends on the league. Certainly, conversations with the WNBA, they are very forward with the fact that that league is Black and that league is full of LGBTQ folks. Looking at the response, maybe 2 weeks ago, forgive me, time's running together, to Lasia Clarendon, who is transgender and has started to transition. It was extremely positive and supportive of their journey. So I think it depends on the league in a given moment. I think we're not speaking to that activism quite as, I think it depends on where you are, where that conversation is happening.
Okay.
Hasn't
No,
been
that's
forgotten. I think that's one that, again, not my particular area of expertise, but certainly I think also because I look at the media sources with which I engage, it's there regularly. These I engage with the folks who are having these conversations, but I understand how it does not seem quite as salient at this moment.
right, right. Based on the magnitude of where we are right now, right?
Yeah, and I that's something that could change in a minute. Although probably it's more a factor of we probably need to be calling more attention to it,
Right.
um, as much as again, we got a lot of problems to fix. And we need to be careful to not let those very real concerns get lost in the shuffle because sport is for everyone. We need to have a place in sport for everyone and have it be accepting and comfortable. I mean, we talked earlier about it being that escape.
Right.
How many of us have talked about it as a place of community? I think that's something we need to work towards.
No, great point, Lauren. And yeah, sports is the best of us in so many ways. It's a great example,
It
and
can
that's
be.
it can be, and that's where this activism it
Mhm.
comes from. Is if we can model it here in our locker rooms and everything else, let's talk about it in the other spaces as well. And our next question leans in a little bit more on the gender space and some backdrop again, folks. Take a look at the pay conversations in the WNBA, the U.S. Women's National Team. That certainly is out there for us to consider. And with that, the question is as follows: in recent history, it seems that women's sports have been more vocal about some of these issues. Do you think there's a reason that the women tend to be more outspoken? Could you argue that they have more to fight for, but that also means that they have more to risk? What are your thoughts on this?
We don't have a good answer because, again, it's the activist identity that tends to be the motivation, not your gender. You do tend to see more. Now, in the case of the WNBA, actually, those players fighting with the league, most of those women go overseas and make more money the rest of the year. So there is a little leverage in that respect. But I think so many of them are committed to growing the game here at home that that's so vital for them. US soccer is a wildly different conversation because of the issues with intersectionality that I alluded to earlier, that yes, it's a gender specific issue, but because US soccer for so many years has failed with the race piece, um, bringing that together has been harder. I also think in the case of US soccer, those women are fighting because that argument seems very obvious. I mean, are we paying attention to what they're doing? And I hope I hope the men are successful. I am fingers crossed for that 2026 World Cup at home for the guys, but I just the women's argument is just so seemingly obvious that that's also part of it. They recognized when they had the leverage, they recognized the tide was turning and took advantage of it, but there is still a lot to risk.
Absolutely, absolutely. The next question we have, Lauren, and it goes back to an earlier topic that we had discussed, which is, representation in the coaching ranks and in the executive spaces. And for those of you that may not be aware, again, the Rooney Rule, which we spoke to a
Mhm.
little bit earlier, it comes from the National Football League to try and address the ineffective practices that have been in place for a number of years and having more diverse coaching staffs, most notably. The question is, some critics may say that, oh, they've hired Coach X over Coach Z. Do you incentivize things by offering draft compensation? A lot of these rules feel like they're going to fall flat. How do you feel about rules such as this being put into place? How can more people of color break into these front office roles so that they can become decision makers, and that the demographics of owners and coaches are more reflective of the players in the sports leagues, not just in the NFL, but in others? And does this have to be a grassroots movement where players and fans continue to put pressure for this change to be realized?
Short answer, yes. You've got to hit the owners where it hurts, um, which is easier said than done because they are very wealthy people. So impacting the bottom line isn't that easy. But you need these rules as much as I don't think the Rooney Rule is effective. Um, I even think when you look at Title IX, as important as Title IX is, Title IX lacks the legal teeth. When you look at how many institutions have truly answered for their Title IX violations, how many institutions are actually in alignment with Title IX, it's it's not great. Um, so I think we need to continue a grassroots effort. I think again, money's the way to get things done. So if you can hurt the owners in their wallets, that will make a difference. But again, that's going to take substantive change. That means getting a lot of folks to prioritize things, and that is proven easier said than done. I don't think that's a reason to stop working on it. Obviously, I engage in this research because I think it's important. I think being willing to put yourself out there and fight for things that maybe are beyond you, but may make things better for someone else it's worth my time. It's worth our energy. Um,
Right.
but I mean, it's the money. Money is power.
Money is power, and with that, bringing together of spirits and minds and thoughts and ideas around these items, we can see change occur. So to this question about grassroots efforts to initiate these changes, what better example of that than what occurred this past summer in the National Football League with respect to the Washington football team? And we had referenced very briefly Jim Thorpe in our comments. And the next question, Dr. Brown, comes from that space, maybe talking a little bit more about advocacy and allyship for our indigenous peoples in the complicated history when it comes to cultural appropriation around sports mascots and those different items. We saw how when some folks come together and say, hey, let's change, let's do better, it happened overnight. The Washington football team, literally, that happened within just a couple of days time, but it was an item that was under much conversation for decades. So if you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit to that dynamic, that would be fantastic.
I The Washington football team again is a perfect example of sponsors said no. Sponsors said enough is enough. They were careful to read the room in that moment. Um, but I think I mean, that the fight over that nickname has gone back years, including them losing their copyright and trademark rights for several years. Now that went back and forth, but they lost those rights because the nickname was deemed racist to begin with. Um, and I don't want to give them too much credit, considering my colleague Martin Brett. His kid was about 6 when he pointed out the problem. So, I think from the mouths of babes, like recognize what's going on. But it's again, it's the money, it's changing people's minds to let things go. And what changed Daniel Snyder's mind was his corporate sponsors, which are an incredibly important revenue stream, said, "We are done, thank you very much." So that's what you need to do. If you go after Coca-Cola's Twitter account enough saying this is not acceptable, this is not acceptable, this is not acceptable, they're going to start to pay attention, especially because again, this summer, read the room. Take the temperature of what is going on in our society, and people didn't have the stomach for it. And we had good change come with that. Now, that was also the most obviously racist nickname in sport. We still have quite a ways to go. Obviously, again, that picture of Patrick Mahomes was put in the presentation for a reason, because these
Right.
are conversations we need to keep having.
Exactly. The tomahawk chop, unfortunately, was still present in the Super Bowl. So,
Yeah. Yeah, among other places. That's the problem, is that's one of those things that's just, it feels like it's omnipresent. It's like, folks, you can't come up with something better. I mean,
right.
we we engage in some stupid stuff in the arenas. Like, you can't come up with some different version of like the wave. Like, we all still buy into that, and that's, congratulations, you stood up and you yelled. Like, come on, we can do better
We can.
than the tomahawk chop.
We can. That's for so many reasons. Absolutely. Well, we're getting close to 8 o'clock, and we always try to keep these
Mhm.
conversations within the confines of an hour. We have two more questions, and two interesting ones, and the one is it comes from the golf space. So I'm glad that
Okay.
we're speaking to that space, and it talks about Tiger Woods and Dr. Brown. The question is as follows: There certainly Tiger Woods was not the first athlete to practice infidelity. Um,
Mhm.
there are several athletes that come to mind who have unfortunately been in that space. However, the news of most athletes' infidelities fall off the radar rather quickly. But Tiger, for some reason, it continues to manifest itself, even with his recent rises to prominence again with some of the successes he's had in the golf space. Can you speak a little bit about this dynamic, and why are his infidelities considered so permanent compared to some athletes in other sports?
I will speak as plainly as I think I am comfortable doing, knowing I'm being recorded. But golf's history is fraught with racism. I mean, if we want to look at sports that have a ton of problems, when you look at like golf's integration and when golf has made progress, it's more often than not because they've been about to get sued and they are about to legally be forced into changes. Please don't think they're doing things because we recognize it's time. So I think there's that element there. The Tiger story was sensationalized. There's no doubt elements of it just became it. The tabloids couldn't have written it better. I think that's part of the problem. And additionally, and one of the things that actually also relates to our changes in activism is the proliferation of social media. While from in an activist space, this has allowed our athletes to communicate directly. They no longer need the media buy-in, because I don't think ESPN would be quite as open to some of the conversations that our athletes are having on a regular basis at this point. But when you look at when Tiger's controversy initially hit, we're just starting to see the proliferation of social media, and folks could engage in this in a level um, that we hadn't seen at that point. He was the biggest athlete in the world at that point. We can debate that, but he's up there as part of that conversation. And you take the confluence of all of those things, the underlying racism that has been in golf for so many years, the sensational nature of everything, and then the fact that people now had a place to talk about it all the time, whenever they wanted, unchecked for facts and things of that nature. So um, I think that contributed to all of it. Um, I would like to think that we've all moved on from that conversation at this point, because again, we've got bigger fish to fry. What Tiger's personal life needs to be Tiger's personal life, and that's between him, his ex-wife, and God. So
Right.
we need to let that go. But it stinks for all the reasons that I just entail.
Right, absolutely. And again, our attendees, please take a look at that complicated history in golf, in particular, Augusta National, even when in the gender space, right, Dr. Brown? So, thank you to our attendee for that question. And the last question for this evening, and I think it's a great one for us to conclude our conversations, is Dr. Brown, what can we do to empower our athletes and their activism here at DeSales and our DeSales athletes and all the sports, amazing sports we have here in Bulldog territory?
Okay, so this is actually a great question, because one of the things I wanted to make sure I did at the end of the night was acknowledge the work that Scott's done since he got here. He does not know I'm saying this. I was not paid to say this. But I think we are, this is my 8th year at DeSales. I have never and will never be quiet about speaking up for what's right. But I think we have not had a culture where these conversations could happen on our campus. I think that is starting to change. Like anything else, empowering our athletes needs to also, we need to get buy-in from our coaches. We need to get buy-in from Gracia, from Coach Koval, and make sure that there is an environment that is comfortable for all of our students. And I think for so many folks on our campus, this isn't a comfortable conversation. And I know that because there have been some times that I have said things to people and they've been like, what are we going there? And the answer is yes. It is time for us to go there. And I think, again, the work Scott has done is starting to create a space where we have these informed conversations. But I would tell our athletes, find your space wherever that is, even if that's not through your team. There are folks on campus who are interested in engaging in these conversations. We have more and more groups, student groups, who are engaging in these conversations. Find a local group close to your house, or don't know what to do, shoot me an email. It may get lost for a minute, but I think everybody needs the opportunity to find their voice. It took me a long time to do this. If you had approached me 15 years ago and said, put yourself out there, research this, learn more about it so that you can intelligently engage with folks on this topic and say things that maybe not popular, I wouldn't have done it. So take the time to find your space, but talk to other folks who have done it before. Learn more and educate yourself. I can't emphasize that enough, especially for those of us when we're talking about issues of racial justice. It's not always easy. Finding that place where you are coming from, depending on who you are on our campus. Are you are you an ally, or are you someone who is already in the thick of the fight, who is impacted by this on a daily basis? And if you are an ally, understanding where you take a step forward and where you take a step back. For someone like me who's light skinned, I even recognize there are privileges I have that my dark skinned brothers and sisters do not have, because colorism is as problematic as racism. So I understand, I hope, when I need to take a step back. It shouldn't be, I don't need to be front and center for everything. I say this to our sport management and leadership class. Good leaders know when to follow. So I think we need to make sure that not only put yourself out there, but know when to be an ally and how and what that looks like. But again, it's like everything else, it's got to start at the top. So the fact that administration is committed to having Scott here and giving him the space to do what he needs to do, I think is a good first step. So I look forward to seeing what's coming down the pike in the next few years, because I think good stuff is happening.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Yeah, that certainly was not planned. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you for taking the time this evening to have this conversation, and the conversations needed for all the reasons that you stated. And prior to tonight's discussion, I can't help but just reference something I had noticed on some of my social media pages, which was a direct reference to Colin Kaepernick and his work starting back in 2016, which was just a reminder again of the work that's still ahead of us. Philando Castile, Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and many others. Unfortunately, no conviction. That was the whole point of his protest, was to highlight that entire dynamic. So we can do better in having these conversations to talk about these issues, and to understand that the work of DEI, Black Lives Matter, equity is not a political statement. It's just our work to ensure that we are being intentional or inclusive actions, so that we all, in the words of St. Francis of de Sales, be who you are and be that well. And at de Sales, we are committed to that. And again, to our attendees for visiting with us tonight, thanks for joining us.
Thank
and
you.
Dr. Brown, thank you so much for your scholarship and research, introducing that for us this evening.
Thanks so much, Scott. Thank you all for joining. Everyone have a good one.
Have a great week, everyone, and please, we hope to see you next week for more of our Black History Month related events this month. Take care.